Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Solomon, and on behalf of the entire Alumni Relations and Development team, it's my privilege to welcome you to another webinar in the Choate ConnectsUs series. We created this series to keep the greater Choate Rosemary Hall community connected during this time of social distancing. We have received some good feedback about these virtual programs, so stay tuned for more coming up this summer. This afternoon, we are going to have a conversation titled On the Road to Women's Equality. This conversation will be moderated by a member of the Choate Rosemary Hall faculty, Kyra Jenney. Kyra has been at Choate for the past 8 years and was recently named head of the History, Philosophy, Religion, and Social Sciences Department. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, thank you so much, Andrea, and to all of our panelists, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really happy that we're able to have this conversation. So just to introduce everyone to our audience, we have with us today Kristen Clarke, who is the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. We have Shanti Mathew, who's the Deputy Director of the Public Policy Lab, a nonprofit organization based in New York. We have Terry O'Neill, the former president of the National Organization for Women, and we have Stacey Plaskett, Congresswoman representing the U.S. Virgin Islands in the U.S. House of Representatives. So thank you all so much for being here today with us and for having this really important conversation. Because we are strapped for time, I'm just going to jump right in and hopefully talk about some of the great work that all of you are doing. And so, Kristen, I'd like to start with you. We are now in our third week of protests around the country and around the world in response to anti-Black racism and violence. And I know that your organization has really been a frontline organization in a lot of what's been going on. And so I was hoping you could start by just kind of updating us on some of the work that you're doing right now and even in the last couple of days that you've been working on, and kind of give us an update on where things stand.
Well, first, let me say that it's so great to be here. It's always wonderful to reconnect with the Choate alumni community and with fellow alums who are out in the world doing amazing things. And I think that that is a heavy question to start with. As we all know, George Floyd was laid to rest yesterday. And I think that for the entire country, this has been a very emotionally turbulent time. And I just want to, take a moment to acknowledge and recognize the life of George Floyd, somebody who should be here today, and acknowledge that there's a 6-year-old girl who will go through life without her father because of the tragedy that unfolded in Minneapolis. I've been really heartened by all of the demonstrations and protests that we're seeing across the country at every corner. I think that we are a nation at a crossroads, and that the public's consciousness has been awakened by this horrendous tragedy, which makes clear that police violence and racism and white supremacy are very ugly parts of the reality that we are living and breathing through right now in our country. And, these are problems that we have known have always been there, but problems that are hard now to ignore and turn a blind eye to because of the images that go viral and that remind us at every second of the day that there are police officers out there who are willing to use deadly force against African Americans at any turn and without basis. My organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, cares deeply about the ways in which racism infects our criminal justice system. We're a national civil rights organization that works on many issues, voting rights, fair housing, education, criminal justice, all issues that are kind of front and center right now for the country. As we sit here, Congress is holding a hearing, as Congresswoman Plaskett well knows, on policing reform, and I think that that's great. George Floyd's brother testified and gave very powerful testimony this morning that reminds us about the work that Congress needs to do, but there definitely is a role for communities to play in this process. We've got to think about how we reimagine policing in our country. We've got to think about how we can transform policing and get rid of the stain of this warrior mentality that just infects the ranks of policing at virtually every stage. And there are too few communities right now where police officers really see themselves as the guardians of communities. There is a war, right? And we see that with the protests in those places where police officers have chosen to come out in riot gear with their shields and their batons and their pepper spray and their rubber bullets. We've seen tension levels that are very, very high. And in places like Flint, Michigan, where law enforcement has chose to march with communities, we've seen a totally different response and outcome. We are pushing for accountability. And you asked, what are we doing right now? And that's one thing that we're really lifting up, the need to hold police officers accountable who kill. We need to see prosecutions of officers who use deadly force with impunity. We need to deal with police unions that often have collective bargaining agreements in place that act as a stranglehold on police departments that are trying to put in place reforms. I was just listening to the chief of the Minneapolis Police Department who talked about disbanding the police department and what that means. And I actually think that that's a great thing. Let's start with a blank slate and reimagine policing with input from the community, and starting from the ground up, build a police department that can really be about protecting and serving the community. So that's a little bit about what we're doing in that space. The voter suppression problems are the things that keep us up at night and kept me up till about 2 in the morning dealing with the fiasco in Georgia, an election that absolutely was a disaster for voters, especially for Black voters. You had long lines that stretched for hours, people who requested absentee ballots who never got them, and officials who really who didn't care and weren't responsive. Poll sites that opened late, malfunctioning equipment, sites that ran out of paper ballots. It was just a fiasco and nothing you'd expect to see in 2020 in America. So we were busy filing late night lawsuits to get poll hours extended, but that's a big part of what we do, making sure that everyone has voice in democracy and standing up to a lot of the ugly voter suppression efforts that unfold across the country.
Wow, so you've been very busy, and even just in the last 12 hours. So again, thank you for taking the time then to be here. You mentioned accountability and that being sort of a primary focus of the work that your organization is doing. And I'm reminded of the injustice that was committed against Breonna Taylor. And there are so many women and Black women who have been victims of anti-Black racism and violence, and we don't necessarily see their names lifted up quite as often. And so, Terry, maybe you can comment a little bit on how women are oftentimes left out of some of these conversations. I think in this moment right now that's the case, but that's been going on also in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic too, and the disproportionate impact that that has had on women and communities of color.
Yeah, and it's women of color in particular. I mean, just to talk about police brutality for a moment, it turns out, and I knew this from years ago. I was I did some advocacy around the infamous case in Oklahoma City of the police officer who is now serving a sentence of more than 200 years. I mean, he systematically targeted younger women of color for sexual assault. And it turns out that that sexual misconduct is the second most frequently reported instance of police misconduct after the use of excessive force. So it's really important, I think, to understand how police brutality sort of manifests itself differently when you're talking about different populations, including women and disproportionately women of color. Police officers will often target women who seem to be vulnerable, who are using alcohol or drugs, women who may be homeless, women who have various types of vulnerability. So I think we need to really keep that on our radar. And I have not seen the bill that is moving through Congress now, and so I don't know if it includes a thing that's sort of a provision that requires all police departments to at least have a policy, which many of them do not, that it is impermissible for police to engage in sexual misconduct. either on the force, either when they're on duty or off duty. And so that's one thing. But I also want to sort of lift up the issue in this pandemic of what is happening to women, and disproportionately women of color, right? So essential workers are the workers who have to go to work. They're required to go to work, even though that might be dangerous. Essential workers are people who are engaging in childcare, in personal services, in food delivery, in food, stocking the shelves of the grocery stores, all of those essential workers. They're engaged in healthcare, in personal care, and they're very disproportionately women, and disproportionately women of color. One of the biggest problems with that in terms of their safety and their families' safety is that it's also true that essential workers are dramatically underpaid. The federal minimum wage at just a little over $7 an hour, and I don't remember now if it's $7.25 or $7.15. It's a starvation wage. That is not anything like a wage that could actually keep an individual with their head above water, let alone a family. So essential workers are underpaid to begin with. They are less likely to have insurance, and they are now more at risk of needing health care and not having insurance to cover it. And also their families are endangered because at low wages, the density of housing is a real issue. You have multiple generations in one relatively small apartment, and that makes the transmission of the virus, because of essential workers going out in the community and coming back, and going out and coming back, and the transmission of the virus is just that much more likely. So that's one piece of essential workers, and then the other piece, of course, is the militarized crackdown on protests in this country, with the outrageous use of tear gas against peaceful protesters, is increasing the dangers of COVID. Right? COVID-19 is a respiratory illness. You gas people with tear gas, you are automatically making their entire respiratory system weaker, harming it, damaging it, making it less possible for people's own immune systems to fight the virus if they happen to get infected. And again, this is very disproportionately impacting people of color and women of color. So that is something that's definitely keeping me up at night.
And speaking to that, and the sort of disproportionate impact that these crises are having on specific communities, Shanti, that's something that your organization cares a lot about and works specifically on. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the work that you're doing and how you try to lift up community voices and take these intersectional approaches to public policy issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will echo the thanks of everyone for hosting this conversation. And it's a joy and an honor to be in a conversation with these women. So yes, I work really in the sort of operational and wonky bowels, primarily of local government, though have also worked at the federal level, but primarily with executive agencies, and with executive agencies whose job it is to deliver programs and services specifically for low income and disadvantaged communities. And what we do at my organization, Public Policy Lab, is we not only help agencies work on program redesign, service improvements, but we actually do it with members of the public. This can be things like homeless services. Last year, about 115,000 school children in New York City's public school systems lived in some kind of temporary housing situation. So supports for those students and their families, access to mental health care services, access to public benefits programs. The thing I think we see, and that is in fact being revealed at multiple levels in our nation right now, is that policymaking is often traditionally done by people who are quite removed from people who those policies are meant to serve and who they primarily affect. I think the Congresswoman may speak some more to that point, but there can be a distance in terms of physical proximity, but there's also a vast difference in terms of life experience or lived experience, and the amount of power that one has or one is used to having or feeling in a system, as well as the agency that one experiences in one's own life, right? So leadership, I put myself in this category, right? Like I feel quite empowered, we like to think as we design policies and services that folks are rational actors, humans are rational actors. We are often native English speakers. I currently have 3 digital devices within arm's reach, right? I have high-speed broadband internet access. I have unlimited data on my cell phone. I have a salaried job. So those are all aspects of my real lived experience as a human being that influence the way that I'm able to move about the world and to access services, the agency I feel in that, and in interacting with the state. There's also a thing to note here where I am a human being with a physical body and with emotions, and I have to move my physical body in time and space to get to a place, to do a thing. And I bring all my feelings and my lived experience with me. So as we all know, policies are often made, I think, often quite well-intentioned in legislative bodies, made in judicial bodies, and then kicked over to executive agencies whose job it is to turn policies into programs and to regulate them, to administer them and evaluate them. So we can certainly see as we look across our country, there's really quite a lot of power in sort of state level government to make choices, or local government to make choices about who is eligible for programs. How does one apply? Does one have to show up in person to apply for programs? What requirements are there on people to maintain their eligibility in certain programs? And what's interesting, it certainly is with the pandemic, we've actually seen local governments have to sort of shift or transform their operations overnight. So it's been really interesting in the last few months to see actually this what was already a massive social experiment of what does it mean to actually deliver therapeutic services remotely? How do we do that digitally? Is it actually necessary? We're now experiencing maybe women don't have to come in person to their WIC appointment, or they come one time, or they don't have to come with their children to a shelter intake center. All sorts of operational decisions are made, essentially, as my point, that actually can either increase access to social supports and increase humanity and dignity when interacting with the state, or that can decrease access, that can actually decrease humanity and can keep power essentially within the state, as opposed to giving it more and more to the public and to members of the community. And something that we're seeing certainly now, we cannot look away from the power dynamic between the state, specifically police entities, and members of the public, but it happens as well in our social services, right? This disconnect between essentially what is state power and often low-income Black and brown bodies. So what we are trying to do, what we do slowly and surely, is to say, okay, if we actually want to change our structures, right? Like there needs to be work that folks on this call are engaged with every single day, of shifting our power structures, shifting our policies at the federal level, at the state level, at local levels. And then we also need to shift the real operational mechanisms within entities whose job it is to enact those policies on our behalf, right? On behalf of what is our collective representation is supposed to be in government. So how do we actually shift the institutional mechanisms of procurement rules and of application requirements and our technology tools that we use to help folks access all of these things? I think when we look across our system, we need people to be engaged in all these different aspects at all these different leverage points. And for me personally, it's currently occurring sort of deep in the operational bowels of local government.
And I think, it's such an important point that you're making about the role that community members who are actually being impacted by these decisions need to then play in that decision-making process as it rolls out. And as you said, that plays itself out at the federal level as well. And so, Congresswoman, I'm wondering if you can comment on that, some of the things that are on your mind and your role at their federal level, and building off of what Shanti was just talking about.
Sure. Thanks for having me on the call. And yes, I actually clicked off of the hearing that's going on right now. I have it on a little tiny portion of my screen because in this new virtual world, members of Congress have to actually be seen, to be recognized that they're in attendance at these hearings, which are being done virtually. So a little portion of my screen, they're still seeing me. So I'm still technically inside of the hearing that's going on right now. But I don't want to really talk for a long time. And I think it'd be better to allow people, I know we're going to have a chat and you have questions as well that you can ask. But just letting you know a little bit about some of the things that we are currently working on. And I think so many of the women who just spoke, my fellow alums, have just really brought up some excellent points about the time and place that we're in. I think it's just interesting to set the discussion when you have discussions about women. For me, it's never possible for me to remove my color from the discussion of being a woman. The disparities that I face in this country have, I think, less to do with me being a woman than my own race plays. My race, my gender really just compounds the complexity of my life as a woman, as a person of color in this country. But I think more than talk about what we're doing in Congress, I just want to share the things that members of Congress are talking about, particularly with regard to the pandemic. I think we've really noted in communities of color and as well in poor communities the impact of the pandemic on them in ways that just really amplify what some of us have already known and have really been working on. For example, myself, Abigail Spanberg, who's a new member, a freshman from rural Virginia area, have really been keenly focused on broadband and the notion that for us, broadband is in fact what in the 1800s the railroad was, and that we should no longer be looking to the private sector for the last mile, that is in fact the responsibility of government to connect each one of us. And the position that we took was that without fully connecting all Americans, whether that be in rural areas or those who live in very urban areas, New York City, that if we do not connect those individuals, that our economy will never grow, our education will never grow. If children have to continue to go and take cell phones in front of hotspots at McDonald's, in front of libraries to get homework done, that our economy is going to falter in the end. And the pandemic brought that to light. Even more so because children then couldn't go to the McDonald's. They couldn't go to the libraries where previously they had been doing their work. And we see that whole sectors of our population were unable to function during this time. And none more so than in Black families. Particularly, most of there's such a preponderance of Black families that are dependent on Black women's earnings. 8 out of 10 homes, Black homes, Black women are the breadwinners, meaning that either they are the sole provider or they provide at least 40% is the necessary expenses in that family. And more often than not, Black women are in areas that had to continue working, were most vulnerable during the pandemic. We are disproportionately in the service areas. One of our highest employment areas are as working as home care workers, working as LPNs, working in the service industry, in food industry. And so we had mothers who still had to go out and work, children being left at home who were unable to do work that they that school was still requiring them to do remotely. And then those families, those mothers and fathers who did have to go out are also very vulnerable to the pandemic. Coupled with the fact with the health disparities that are already in the African American population, in African American women, across economic and geographies. So you have the preponderance of asthma, of hypertension, of diabetes, which were all things that we learned that COVID-19 proved to be in many cases deadly for individuals. So I think in those ways, looking from a lens of one incident, a pandemic, we can see how issues of race, of gender really play out in this country. And for that reason, the work that people who have those experiences is equally as important. So to have elected officials who are women of color, is very important, because in the next pandemic that we've had, I heard a pastor in Harlem at the one of the protests say that Americans are facing two pandemics, COVID-19 and 1619. 1619 being the year that Black people were first brought to this country. So I think the second pandemic, that being racial right now, has really amplified the issue and the importance of women of color, because as much as those allies that we have that are not women of color, our sisters, our white sisters, our white brothers, there were things that they themselves, as much as they were interested in knowing, were completely unaware of that was going on within the Black community. And so, having discussions like this are really important, and that's why I don't want to talk a long time, so that people can ask, groups like this, our Choate community can ask the kind of questions that have been on their mind in a safe place with individuals who are willing and really want them to engage one another.
Absolutely. And one of those questions that I see come up a lot, and I know it's a question that many of my students have been wrestling with over the past few years recently, is that we are seeing a lot of these conversations come to the kind of national forefront. With the sort of global attention that the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement and now the Say Her Name movement are getting, we're having a lot of these conversations. We are seeing people talk about how it's the year of the woman, and there are more women holding elected positions and running for office than ever before. And yet we are still nowhere close to having a truly representative government, right? And so I'm wondering if you all might just be able to comment on kind of where are we then, if this is supposed to be a time when there is a lot of national attention being paid to these conversations, and what many are hailing as the years of the woman. How much progress are we making? What barriers to progress are we seeing? I mean, where are we really at on this road to gender equality, racial equality? And Kristen, do you have to pop out? Maybe.
Yeah, I do. So maybe I'll just share some parting observations. I know my fellow panelists will have lots to say on this. I think a lot about issues that lie at the intersection of race and gender in the course of my work. I'm glad that you brought up Breonna Taylor and made sure that we lifted up her name in the conversation. When we talk about police violence, you're absolutely right. We have to make sure that we talk about the racial realities of this violence and the gender realities as well. And the truth is that Black women, Sandra Bland, and many others are also victims. I feel like our job as women is to make sure that we are having rounded conversations that speak truth to power, and making sure that the ways in which these issues impact women are not left out of the discussion. In the course of our work as a racial justice organization, we lift up issues like paid leave that have unique impacts on low income women of color. I'm really heartened by what we're seeing in the political space. More women of color who are representing communities, states at every level. We've got a record number of Black women in Congress, and I'm so proud that we have a Choate alumna who stands out as one among them. And I think we got to keep fighting and keep pushing and keep reminding ourselves that, while there are these kind of moments of progress, that the progress is fragile, and that we still have a long ways to go to achieve racial equality and gender equality in our country. But thank you so much for having me as a part of this discussion. I greatly appreciate it. And though we can't see the Choate alumna and members of the Choate community who are with us, I'm so glad that they're a part of this discussion today.
And thank you for joining us and for all the work that you're doing right now. So we really appreciate your being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you.
I think it's one of the things that's interesting to me is being a member of Congress. There are a record number of women that are serving. Over 100 women of Congress are serving. We have 5 women of color in the Senate, Hispanic, Asian Pacific, African American, African Caribbean women, African Indian women, and one person, multiracial, multi-ethnic individuals. There is, I think there's been a lot of work in this last year on issues of gender pay, equality in women. And I've seen a lot of legislation related to that, a lot of discussion. I sit on the Oversight Committee, which is now chaired by Carolyn Maloney, who's a member of Congress from New York, who has for decades now been working on women's equality. And so let me be careful with how I say this. I sometimes am frustrated when I see discussions that are around gender, which are not equal in their veracity and their passion for women of color. For example, many women in Congress were very upset about the Kavanaugh hearings. And there were a large group of women who were members of Congress who locked arms and went across to the Senate to be there for the hearing. Bless them. I was asked to go and I did not go because those same women had nothing to say when there were remarks and pointed attacks on women of color that they work with, that are their colleagues. There was silence in that regard. And so I just, am often frustrated by where the intentions and the energy of the Me Too movement and others are with respect to, Black girls, Black women. And I think that, that's why you saw in this last Congress, there's always been a women's caucus, and they've been very active. And last Congress, there was the creation of a Black Women and Girls Caucus. You would think that that would be superfluous, right? It would be unnecessary in the sense that there's already a Congressional Black Caucus. And there is a women's caucus, and that is a bipartisan caucus and subsets of that women's caucus. But the Black women recognize that, our issues are not being addressed by these groups. And so we have got to ourselves push that discussion. And I see that, in every facet of life, going back to my time, even at Choate. So.
I think that it's such an important point. And I think this is right now in this moment, something that white women in particularly really need to be wrestling with. And maybe Terry, you can actually comment to that. I mean, what are some of the things that, sort of building off of the Congresswoman's comments, white women need to be thinking about right now and really wrestling with and digging deep to ask themselves, why is it that for so many Black Lives Matter doesn't seem like a feminist cause? And
I'm grateful that, Terry, I saw you nodding while I was speaking.
Yes, I'm grateful for those comments. I mean, I think that's exactly right. What white women need to do is develop a habit of mind, which we do not have right now. But that habit of mind must be, whenever you're thinking about a particular issue, like sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace, the first question you should ask yourself is, how does this issue impact women of color? How does it how does it affect women with disabilities? How does it affect the LGBT community, women and men in the LGBTQ community? Because of course, white women have a tendency to look at it from their own experience. This is, and it's Shanti, it's something that you mentioned before. People making policy are not necessarily connected to the everyday lived experience of people who will be most affected by that policy. If we could create what I think of as an intersectional habit of mind, you ask the question about marginalized women first when you do that. You know, when I was president of NOW, I led the organization to change its statement of purpose, right? The basic mission statement of the organization now says that its purpose is to take action through intersectional feminist organizing to bring about equality for all women. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to make it essential for all chapters and for the national office itself, whenever they're going to think about an issue, they have to do it intersectionally, meaning they have to look to the margins and see how does that issue impact marginalized women, and what does it need to look like? You know, so it's a start. It's absolutely a start. You will find that that is a hard habit to get into. And look, 53% of white women in this country, right, voted for Donald Trump. Right? The vast majority of those women don't consider themselves feminists, fine, but the reality is white women in this country, including those of us who consider ourselves to be intersectional feminists, have family members. We have sisters and cousins who are white women who voted for Donald Trump, and that I think makes it harder for us to maintain that habit of mind, that intersectional habit and way of thinking about things. So but we have to make that the goal, I think.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Shanti.
Two reflections on what has been shared. One is that, you know, in the design community, there's a lot of talking about design for the extremes. Like, if you can actually design anything for the people who are going to have the hardest time accessing the thing that you're designing, whatever it is, then everyone else will be fine. You know, because if we can design actually, or think about those, or design with, make choices with those who have less power, those who have less access, those who have fewer resources, then those who have more of those things will inherently be able to access whatever choice it is, whatever program we're creating, policy, et cetera. I don't know if this will be a provocative thing to say, but I feel as though there are many narratives that have come to the forefront in our country that we've had to wrestle with, historical narratives. You know, I think been talking quite a bit about the war on drugs, or recently. That's a narrative that was created in order to sell a certain set of positions and choices that we, I think, now have had to recognize as a narrative. I wonder how much we've wrestled with a similar narrative of the welfare queen.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
Right, and we actually have narratives that we have built about people that allow us to make certain judgments or choices or feel certain ways about them. And there is a very strong one that we've created about poor Black women that I don't know that has been really lifted up as a thing that we should actually wrestle with and interrogate and make amends for.
I think that's oh, go ahead. Sorry, Terry, go ahead.
So glad you raised that. I think that's a huge thing. There's an organization called Sister Song, a Women of Color Collective for Reproductive Justice. And when they talk about reproductive justice, they include the right to be a mother. And the attacks on the so-called welfare queen are very much attacks on low-income women's right to be moms. African American women and women of color are far more likely to have their children taken from them on charges of neglect, when in fact it's because they're low income and they have to be at work and they're trying to cobble together childcare and can't do it. And that's that whole that goes along with the whole stereotype, the targeting of so-called welfare queens. And I think so for example, when we think about reproductive rights and reproductive justice, we really need to think about women's right to be mothers, to have the kind of economic security and the kind of safe and adequate housing that would allow them to actually exercise their reproductive right to be a mom.
So I do want to be mindful of time because I realize we only have a few minutes left, and I wish we could keep this conversation going, but I know you're all quite busy. I'm hoping that maybe we could close with just a few words from each of you about some action steps for our audience members moving forward, and some things that people who are listening today or that we can do to keep pushing in all of the ways that you all have mentioned. Congresswoman, would you like to start?
I knew you were going to pick me. Well, you know, I am grateful that I'm part of a family of people, my Choate family, of people willing to listen. And this has been a really difficult week for Black people who have white friends, of talking and listening and explaining and trying to educate. And so I'm grateful and I applaud the people of this community for being willing to listen and learn, you know, having that continual learning process and being able to say, I didn't know that and I don't know that and I want to learn more. That is, you know, was brought to tears by a classmate of mine at Choate who reached out and was, you know, he was like, I want to know more. I want to be able to have good conversations with my children during this time. I recognize that there's a lot that I have been insulated from, and so want to hear more about that and not talking at each other, but really trying to share. So, you know, there's such a wealth of information out there, and please don't let it just all be social media. You know, again, being on the oversight, I am just frightened by the amount of disinformation, not even misinformation, but purposeful disinformation that is out there that other countries are really injecting into what I believe is a healthy time for us. This seems very painful, but I believe this is a really important part of the American experience and why we are, and I know people may not agree, I believe we are the greatest country in the world because there's no country that does not have these issues. There are other countries that do not have these gender issues or ethnic or race issues, but we're willing to be very upfront and personal and virulent about that. So thank you for an opportunity to have this discussion. And anybody can reach out to my office. You know, whoever answers the phones know that if they say they went to Choate, it's immediately you have to respond to them. But, you know, reach out if there's work that you need or support that you need, information. There's so much, you know, Terry, you've really laid the groundwork with your organization and others in this discussion and the continual push for gender equality. You know, one that I'm you know, I have 4 boys, but I do have a girl. And I'm always concerned about that, not just in education, but then what is available in the workspace after that.
Thank you. We only have about a minute left, but maybe Terry and Shanti, just a quick action step that you'd like to see our audience members or ourselves take part in.
You know, I think read Ta-Nehisi Coates. Go on to the website of the African American Policy Forum, which is led by Kim Crenshaw, to learn about intersectionality, to learn about how we can move forward. And then I'm a I believe in community organizing. I believe in being active in your community. Go to your community, find the groups that are working on voting rights. Kristen's group is doing an amazing job. There's a lot of organizations you can plug into for voting rights, which are so crucially important right now. But also police brutality and ending police brutality, and educate yourself about the idea of defunding police. It is not a radical idea. And there's a lot of really great academic research out there about it, so educate yourself, find out about it.
Thanks, and Shanti, you want the final word?
Agree with all of that. And then what I try to do, practically speaking, is look around at my life and say, what do I have power over? And how do I create more access in the things that I have power over? So something I'm doing this week is starting a recruiting process for our fall fellowship program. So looking around, if you are a business owner, if you're a manager, where do you have influence? For me, very practically, it's saying, how do I recruit women? How do I hire women? How do I mentor women? That's what I'm looking for. So how do we actually create pipelines and systematically and structurally give people access? And whatever that is in your world, you are the only one who knows that.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
And I should also say just one other resource that I really do want to mention is the Transformative Justice Coalition. They're a wonderful group also working on voting rights and other types of highly intersectional work. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Stacey, Kristen, Terry, and Shanti. We know you are all extremely busy, and it's been wonderful for us to be with you this afternoon. And special thanks to you, Kyra, for facilitating a very powerful, informative, and critical conversation for us all to think about. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Stay healthy and take care of each other.